Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the world around you has fallen silent, not in sound, but in thought. People walk with hurried steps, eyes fixed on glowing screens, fingers scrolling endlessly. Headlines flash, slogans repeat, opinions echo. And yet, in all this noise, there is very little thinking. The city feels alive, but something essential is missing. Conversations are fast but shallow. Outrage burns brightly but fades just as quickly. Attention shifts from one controversy to the next without ever stopping long enough to ask, why? Once, the human mind was our greatest tool, a weapon for curiosity, for inquiry, for discovery. But what happens when that tool is dulled? When questioning becomes rare, when reflection is abandoned, when reasoning itself begins to vanish? This is not a distant nightmare. It is already here. We live in an age of information, yet wisdom is harder to find than ever. We are surrounded by voices, but few are truly our own. People repeat what they've been told, convinced that loudness is the same as truth, that repetition is the same as understanding. And without realizing it, we trade independence for convenience, clarity for comfort, freedom for belonging. So pause for a moment. Step back from the rush, the noise, the endless scrolling. Ask yourself, what happens when thinking itself disappears? What becomes of a society where people no longer question, no longer reason, no longer see beyond the surface? Because the danger is not simply ignorance. It is something far more subtle, far more contagious. A collective sleep, a collective stupidity, spreading silently while the world keeps moving. And the question is no longer if it will shape our future, but whether we have the courage to resist it before it does. Thinking has always been hard work. It demands effort, patience, and humility. But in today's world, it's not only difficult, it is discouraged. Look closely, and you'll see how the modern environment rewards everything but deep thought. It rewards speed. It rewards outrage. It rewards conformity. And this isn't an accident. From the moment we wake up, algorithms shape what we see, carefully feeding us the headlines, the opinions, the fragments of reality that we are most likely to agree with. The more predictable we are, the easier we are to manage. Schools train us to memorize, not to question. Media trains us to consume, not to investigate. And slowly, without even realizing it, we are conditioned to stop thinking for ourselves. The philosopher Noam Chomsky warned of this decades ago. He called it the manufacturing of consent, a quiet process where populations are guided, nudged, persuaded into compliance. Not by force, but by distraction. Not by silencing questions, but by making people forget to ask them in the first place. Critical thinking, once seen as a fundamental human skill, is now treated as an inconvenience. It slows down debates. It complicates narratives. It dares to ask, but is this really true? And in a world obsessed with certainty, asking that question is seen as dangerous. But think about it. What kind of world emerges when questioning becomes taboo? When independent thought is replaced with sound bites? When outrage is easier than dialogue? We are beginning to see that world take shape around us. A world where people no longer engage with ideas, but with reactions. A world where it is safer to follow than to stand alone. A world that mistakes noise for knowledge and certainty for truth. This is the crisis of thought. Not that people are incapable of thinking, but that we are being trained, conditioned, even rewarded for not doing it. And if we lose the ability to think for ourselves, then we lose far more than just debate or dialogue. We lose freedom itself. One of the greatest forces shaping this decline in thinking is something you experience every single day: information overload. More data, more updates, more opinions than any mind in human history has ever had to process. According to neuroscientists, the average person today absorbs nearly 5 times more information per day than someone living just a few decades ago. 5 times. Imagine the strain on a mind that was never designed for this constant bombardment. Every notification, every breaking headline, every endless scroll of comments and reactions, it fragments your attention. And when the brain is overwhelmed, it does what all systems do under stress. It takes shortcuts. It leans on old habits. It falls back on cognitive biases. It listens less to reason and more to the voices around it. This is why we rely so heavily on social proof. If a post has thousands of likes, we assume it must be true. If everyone in our circle repeats the same belief, we begin to accept it, not because we examined it carefully, but because it feels familiar, it feels safe. This is not reason speaking. It is survival instinct. And yet it is the very instinct that can be exploited most easily. Marketers know this. Politicians know this. Influencers know this. The more information we are flooded with, the less we analyze, the more we react. And reaction is predictable, programmable, controllable. The result? A society where people confuse popularity with truth, where the loudest voices rise, not because they are wise, but because they are constant. But here's the danger. When you stop weighing ideas on their merit, when you let numbers and repetition guide your thinking, you surrender the very independence that defines a free mind. You no longer ask, is this true? You simply ask, do others believe it? And once that shift happens, critical thought doesn't just fade, it disappears. So pause again and ask yourself, how often do you stop to question the information thrown at you? How often do you trace a claim back to its source? Or are you simply letting the current of collective opinion carry you along, hoping that if enough people believe it, it must be right? Because that is how collective stupidity spreads, not through a lack of intelligence, but through the absence of pause. There was a time when knowledge grew slowly, when the act of reading a book or reflecting on an idea was not just common, but essential. But today, that practice, the discipline of deep reading, is fading away. And with it, something far greater is being lost. Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf has shown how digital media is rewiring our brains. We skim instead of focus. We jump from tab to tab, screen to screen, headline to headline, without ever sitting long enough with a single idea to truly understand it. Our attention has become fractured, trained for speed, but incapable of depth. Think about your own habits. When was the last time you read a full article, start to finish, without glancing at your phone? When was the last time you sat with a difficult question, without rushing to Google for an answer, without skipping ahead to the summary, without craving the shortcut? These small habits, once ordinary, are now rare. And yet they are the foundation of critical thought. Because analysis, reflection, and understanding require more than a glance. They require time, silence, and patience. Carl Sagan once issued a chilling warning. He said, "We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology." His fear was not just ignorance. It was the loss of the very ability to think critically about the systems we depend on. And that fear has only grown more real in our digital age. Without deep reading, our minds become skimmers. We take in fragments, not ideas. We react to impressions, not arguments. We gather information, but never assemble it into wisdom. And in that shallow current, it becomes harder and harder to separate truth from noise. This is why reading matters, not just as entertainment, not just as education, but as training for the mind. The ability to sit with a book, an essay, a long argument, to wrestle with it, to question it, to absorb it slowly. That is the very muscle of critical thought. And the less we exercise it, the weaker it becomes. So the question is simple. Are we still capable of slow thought in a fast world? Or are we trading the depth of understanding for the illusion of knowing everything at once, while in reality, knowing almost nothing at all? If we want to understand why critical thinking is disappearing, we have to go back to where it should have been cultivated in the first place, the classroom. Education was once imagined as a path to freedom, a way to sharpen the mind and prepare individuals to think for themselves. But in practice, it has often done the opposite. John Taylor Gatto, an award-winning teacher and fierce critic of the school system, argued that modern schooling was never designed to produce independent thinkers. In his words, "The truth is that schools don't really teach anything except how to obey orders." And when you look closely, it's hard to disagree. From the industrial age to today, schooling has been less about curiosity and more about conformity. Students are rewarded for memorization, for coloring inside the lines, for giving the right answer rather than asking a better question. Think about it. How many times were you taught what to think rather than how to think? How often was original thought encouraged? And how often was it ignored, or worse, punished for being disruptive? Over time, the message becomes clear. Follow the rules, stay in line, and don't challenge the system. That conditioning doesn't end at graduation. It follows us into adulthood, into the workplace, into politics, even into our friendships. The result? People learn to stay quiet when they disagree. They avoid raising questions that might make others uncomfortable. They fear being labeled difficult, controversial, or disloyal. And in that silence, conformity spreads. What begins as obedience in school becomes compliance in society. And compliance, over time, becomes complicity. The psychologist Eric Fromm called this the escape from freedom. He observed that many people secretly want to surrender their independence of thought because freedom brings responsibility, and responsibility can be frightening. To think for yourself means you can no longer hide behind the crowd. You can no longer blame others for your ignorance. You must carry the weight of your own conclusions. And for many, that weight feels unbearable. So instead, we choose comfort. We choose to obey. We choose the safety of the group over the risk of the question. And in doing so, we begin to lose the very essence of education, not just in schools, but in life itself, the courage to think independently. Critical thinking is not only intellectually demanding, it is emotionally uncomfortable. To question deeply means to face the possibility that you might be wrong. It means admitting that your most cherished beliefs, the ideas you've built your identity on, might not hold the weight you thought they did. And for many, that is unbearable. The truth is, our egos are fragile. We like certainty. We like confidence. We like to feel that we know who we are and what we believe. But the moment we begin to think critically, those walls start to shake. We experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the painful clash between what we want to believe and what the evidence actually shows. And in a culture that prizes identity above all else, questioning your own beliefs can feel like betraying yourself. So instead of facing the discomfort, we defend. We retreat into our tribes. We memorize mantras. We cancel. We block. We unfollow. We avoid. We surround ourselves with those who already agree with us, so we never have to confront the anxiety of being challenged. What once was dialogue becomes a performance. What once was debate becomes a war of slogans. And in the end, no one is listening, because listening itself requires humility, and humility is rare. The psychologist Eric Fromm recognized this decades ago. He said many people would rather surrender their freedom than face the heavy responsibility of thinking for themselves. Because to think for yourself is to risk isolation. It is to risk being misunderstood. It is to risk stepping outside the circle of belonging. And for most, belonging feels safer than truth. But here lies the tragedy. In choosing belonging over truth, we do not only lose our independence, we lose ourselves. We become echoes of others, repeating what the group wants to hear. We trade the sharp edge of individuality for the dull comfort of conformity. And slowly, without noticing, we forget what it feels like to stand in the uncertainty of an honest question. If there is one force that has accelerated the decline of critical thinking more than any other, it is social media. What began as a promise of connection has transformed into a battlefield of opinions, outrage, and endless distraction. These platforms were not built to encourage reflection. They were designed to keep you scrolling. They thrive not on truth, but on engagement, not on clarity, but on conflict. Every notification, every trending post, every carefully tailored feed is part of a system that rewards speed over depth. You are nudged toward content that confirms what you already believe, because agreement keeps you comfortable and comfort keeps you hooked. Why pause to analyze when reacting earns you likes? Why weigh evidence when outrage earns you followers? The quiet act of thinking cannot compete with the loud spectacle of performance. Philosopher Marshall McLuhan saw this coming in the 1960s when he warned, "The medium is the message." He meant that the way we receive information shapes the way we think. And today's mediums, the endless scroll, the bite-sized headline, the viral clip, shape us into reactors, not thinkers. The more we consume, the less we contemplate. The more we share, the less we understand. In this world, truth itself becomes distorted. What matters is not whether something is accurate, but whether it spreads. Virality becomes the measure of reality. And when enough people repeat a claim, it begins to feel true, even when it isn't. This is the new tyranny of the majority, not political, but cognitive. A dictatorship of the feed, where truth is outvoted by attention. And so the quiet voices of reason are drowned out. Thoughtfulness appears slow, outdated, even irrelevant. Why sit with complexity when certainty feels so much better? Why reflect in silence when shouting earns applause? And in this economy of attention, the very skill of critical thought begins to vanish. Not because it is impossible, but because it no longer seems necessary. To truly understand why we fall into this trap, we need to look inward, into the machinery of the human mind itself. Because the problem is not only outside us, in schools, in media, in algorithms. It is also inside us, in the way our brains are built to think. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman described it in his groundbreaking work, Thinking, Fast and Slow. He showed that we live with two systems of thought. The first is fast, automatic, instinctive, emotional. It jumps to conclusions, it reacts quickly, it conserves energy. The second is slow, deliberate, rational, analytical. It questions, it weighs, it takes effort. And here lies the challenge. In our high-speed, always-on world, we spend most of our lives stuck in fast mode. Fast thinking is useful. It keeps us alive. It helps us decide in moments of danger. But it is also vulnerable. It relies on mental shortcuts, heuristics, stereotypes, familiar patterns. And those shortcuts feel right, even when they are wrong. This is why propaganda works. This is why advertising works. This is why we mistake repetition for truth. The fast brain doesn't want to investigate. It wants to move on. The slow brain, on the other hand, requires discipline. It demands silence, patience, and concentration. And in a world that pushes us to react instantly, few of us take the time to engage it. The result? Even intelligent people fall into traps. We defend beliefs we've never examined. We accept claims we've never verified. We feel certain, even when the evidence is thin. And once we feel certain, we stop questioning. Confirmation bias locks us in place. Groupthink silences our doubts. And without noticing, we begin to live not by reason, but by reflex. This is why critical thinking is disappearing. Not because we lack the ability, but because the world around us keeps us in fast mode, while the slow, reflective mind, the very mind that builds wisdom, remains neglected. If the world around us pushes us into speed, reaction, and conformity, then the act of reclaiming our mind becomes nothing short of revolutionary. But how do we begin? The first step is awareness. To notice when we are thinking and when we are simply reacting. To ask, am I forming this belief or am I just absorbing it? This practice has a name, metacognition, thinking about our thinking. It is the pause before the reaction, the moment of silence before the response. And in that pause, everything changes. Instead of being swept along by emotion or crowd opinion, we create space to choose, to question, to reflect. Another powerful practice is dialectical thinking, the ability to hold two opposing ideas in your mind at once and to explore them without rushing to a conclusion. This is not weakness, it is strength. It means you are not trapped by binaries, not imprisoned by us versus them. It means you are willing to live in complexity until clarity emerges. But perhaps the greatest requirement for reclaiming your mind is courage. The courage to admit that you might be wrong. The courage to listen to voices you disagree with, not to defeat them, but to understand them. The courage to question your own assumptions, even the ones that feel most sacred. Because the antidote to collective stupidity is not intelligence. It is courage. The courage to keep asking when everyone else has stopped. Socrates, one of the earliest defenders of critical thought, said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." He was not mocking himself. He was inviting us to stay curious, to stay humble, to resist the arrogance of certainty. Because once you believe you have all the answers, your mind stops searching. But when you admit you do not know, you open the door to discovery. Critical thinking is often treated as a purely intellectual skill, a tool for argument, a method for analysis. But in truth, it is something deeper. It is not only mental, it is spiritual. Because to think critically is to choose truth over comfort, freedom over approval, growth over certainty. And that choice touches the very core of who we are. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And he was right. To question the world around us is difficult, but to question ourselves is harder still. To ask, why do I believe what I believe? Where did this idea come from? What fear keeps me from letting it go? These are not just intellectual exercises. They are spiritual confrontations. They strip away illusions. They reveal the difference between the person you think you are and the person you truly are. And this is why critical thinking feels dangerous. It is not just about dismantling falsehoods outside. It is about dismantling the illusions within. It is about facing the possibility that the identity you defend, the tribe you cling to, the certainty you treasure, might be built on foundations of sand. That realization can shake us. It can even break us. But it is also the only path to freedom. Because once you dare to think critically, you begin to see the structures that shape your life, the systems of manipulation, the masks people wear, the roles you've unconsciously accepted. And while this clarity can be unsettling, it is also liberating. For only in truth, however uncomfortable, can freedom be found. Critical thinking, then, is not just a skill. It is an act of awakening, a decision to open your eyes, even when the light burns. And so, we arrive at the final question: what will you do with your mind? Will you allow it to be shaped by noise, molded by trends, pulled along by the tide of collective opinion? Or will you reclaim it, slowly, deliberately, courageously, as your own? The rise of collective stupidity is not a cause. It is a symptom of fear, of fatigue, of distraction. But every act of clear thought pushes back against it. Every pause before reacting, every question asked with honesty, every moment of humility is a quiet rebellion. The world does not need louder voices. It does not need sharper arguments. It needs deeper minds, minds willing to think slowly in a fast world, to sit with complexity in an age of simplicity, to remain awake when most are sleepwalking. So let this be your invitation, not just to consume, but to reflect, not just to repeat, but to question, not just to know, but to understand. Because the most revolutionary thing you can do today is not to shout louder than the crowd, but to think more clearly than the crowd. And if you choose this path, know that you are not alone. There is a quiet revolution happening, not of outrage, but of awareness, not of noise, but of minds. It begins every time one person has the courage to ask the harder question. Let that person be you. Stay curious, stay awake, and above all, keep thinking.